And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Hello, everyone. It's Wednesday. It's a cold winter night, and we're talking about dark fairy tales.
Yes, we are. I think it's an ideal night to be talking about this, as apparently the Ozarks and the Midwest snowmageddon is rapidly approaching us this evening.
Yes. Very, very appropriate, I think. Well, harshness and night and winter figure prominently in German lore anyway, so it's fitting.
It is fitting, and just that those elements. I can't help but think a little about the reality that our modern processes have really separated us from the wild.
Well, I think so, and I think perhaps that's one reason that we aren't as frightened by fairy tales as we used to be.
It really could be, and I would strongly encourage people, if they are feeling a little numb in that regard, to even just pardon me, safely put themselves into the wild at night uh, for an hour and see what happens. It can be very expansive upon one's sense of perception. And in the dark forest at night, you look up at the stars and suddenly you feel very, very insignificant, which is pretty much the opposite of what one feels when we're glued to social media.
Maybe. It depends. I have my moments.
Yeah.
I feel everything's too significant on social media.
Yes. And that was, I think what happens with social media is that there's a strong temptation to feel extraordinarily significant.
Yeah.
That everything that we have to say is horribly important. And getting out into the wilds is incredibly helpful, because suddenly you realize that we're not that big.
No, we aren't. So where do we want to start with this? I mean, there's a lot of things that we can cover.
There are a lot of things that we can cover. I think, just as a brief overview, what seems to be something I find particularly interesting as we start digging into it. And this is the first time we've really dug into German immigration and culture in the Ozarks. Specifically, we've touched on it peripherally as we're dealing with other subjects, but this is the first time we've really dug into this specifically. That to a large degree, with a few exceptions, German culture as immigrants into the United States, beginning in approximately the 1820s, 1830s, largely assimilated so readily into American culture that it became indistinguishable from American culture as a general rule. And as a result of that, it can be hard to track.
It really, it's almost gets down to names and hints sometimes. Because it seems that in a lot of instances, German immigrants really did try to shed that sense of being other or, apart, more so than some other groups.
Yes. And some of it, I think, because, certainly at the time, and still to a pretty sizable degree today, the original settlers and pioneers were Northern European.
Yes, by and large. I mean, that's true. That's so they did see themselves as separate, and there I think there's some comparisons with immigration by Germans into the Ozarks with the Irish, and similar time frame too.
Yes.
The Irish were escaping the potato famine, etc., and other
Hmm.
issues too, but that was a push in the 1830s and 40s. For Germans, they were looking for opportunities as well. And then in the late 1840s, early 1850s, there was a huge immigration as a result of the Prussian War.
Yeah. And
And that had a big impact. That had a big impact in the United States in the Civil War, because a lot of the trained officers and soldiers, particularly at the beginning of the Civil War, were ex-German soldiers or Prussian soldiers that had combat experience, and quite a few actually in the Ozarks. Most of the Union troops coming out of St. Louis were Germanic. So
yes, which of course creates a unique social commentary on that time period and that time frame.
mhm.
And certainly did its part to inflame the essentially Confederate leaning Missourians who had grown up in Missouri at that
Mhm.
point.
Yes, and the derogatory term that was flung around was Dutch, ironically.
Yes. and that, I think, in and of itself is also interesting. A lot of my personal German ancestry, coming from Pennsylvania into Indiana, and then ultimately to Iowa, was growing up was simply that they were Pennsylvania Dutch.
Mhm. Well, again, that's a way to blend in.
Yes, it is, and continue that process of assimilation. Something that I find interesting, of course, um, German immigration into Arkansas was a statistically significant minority,
Mhm.
and mostly, but not limited to, Catholic immigrants, and that Catholicism and German ancestry was largely conflated with one another in that process.
Which is a little different than in most areas. So,
Hmm. And again, I think something that I would be very interested in, and am very interested in, because I still contend that, well, the traditional folk ways of a people sometimes it's very obvious how, that it's demonstrated that a lot of our ways of gauging, oftentimes from an academic perspective, the ways of gauging a people being, that's been somewhat assimilated, but gauging ethnicity or cultural norms within an ethnicity are really quite primitive and lacking in nuance. The idea that unless there's an on paper society or a festival that could be tracked, so on and so forth, that the ways of that people are dead or gone, and I don't think that's the case.
no, and I think often they do come through very subtly in stories, in habits, customs, that after a generation or two, people just look at and don't associate with whatever group.
No, and that's the sort of this almost the existent but somewhat still very ephemeral underpinning that continues to resonate through from generation to generation, that the following generations would not necessarily even be necessarily aware of.
Exactly.
So
We are a product, we are a product of many generations, whether we want to admit it or not.
we are, and I would really strongly posit that the immigrant German culture of the 19th century into the Ozarks has had a great deal of resonance beyond what has been thus far quantified by academia.
I think so. I think that's a fair statement.
Even though it's not a German culture story for my family, it's a Celtic culture story. One of my favorites. I have written about it, but actually I have it right here. The cooking of the British Isles. For people who say bad things about British cooking, get yourself a copy of this book and start trying the recipes out from it. They're wonderful. But there is, I got this when I was probably early 20s and started thumbing through and found a recipe for Colcannon, which for people who don't know, it's mashed potatoes plus, and but very specific mashed potatoes plus, has cabbage in it. And because it had potatoes, it was mashed potatoes, I thought, hey, I want to try this. So I made it and served it to my mom, and she took a bite of it and went, Grandma Gwen used to make this.
Ah, that's
And
cool.
she said we didn't have a name for it, but she would make this. And I really I found that intrinsically interesting, because to me there was a story there. The fact that down through multiple generations, probably with an Atlantic crossing around 1720, through North Carolina, through West Virginia, through Kentucky, into Iowa, that the from one generation to another, this recipe, which is comparatively simple, but not one that you would just happen to stumble upon. You don't just,
Right.
Just by accident decide to shred a head of cabbage and stir fry it into, a dozen mashed potatoes with butter, salt, and pepper, and onion. And this particular line of my family is Welsh. And so realizing that even though the name had been lost, or even the possibility, because Colcannon, I believe, is more of an Irish name, that that my family line might not even have called it Colcannon, for all anybody knows. But it was the same recipe, and that was just a neat point of discovery. However, on the outside looking in, that's not something that you would churn up and hand to academia to say, please analyze this.
No, and I think that's something that these topics do suffer from, because it's a small box, and certain people look at it and most people don't, that are writing for academia. So.
It is. Now, just jumping into fairy tales, I think there's going directly to this, the most recognizable source point for fairy tales is the works of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm from the early 1800s, who really were working incredibly hard to create a body of work that was in support at the time of the concept of German nationalism.
Yes. I mean, to help form, I don't want, identity is not the right word, but affinity for, and they were, I don't know if they were the first, but it's certainly one of the earliest examples of really, boots on the ground, going through small villages, collecting stories, trying to be methodical, um, and putting all of these things in one place. And that I'm not sure that they had been really done the way they did before that.
And it's very realistic to say that it had not been. It I cannot help but draw some comparisons between the Grimm brothers and Vance Randolph.
Me too. I mean, it makes it's very similar with Vance, going through the Ozarks and talking to people and just trying to collect various uh, anecdotes, stories, lore on innumerable topics and trying to make sense out of it.
and trying to catalog that entire process. It's not, interestingly enough, I mean, 40 years removed, 200 years removed, we oftentimes regard their work very well. At the time, often the idea of going boots on the ground is often looked down upon.
It is, particularly when you're talking about, especially in the case of the Grimm brothers, peasant class. It's just not something that generally was done. I mean, we often joke in history that history is written about kings and queens and very important people, and we don't know a whole lot about how average people lived. And this was one of the first examples of cataloging what ordinary people passed along.
It is, and particularly rural people, which has a surprisingly powerful resonance with the Ozarks being predominantly rural. And we like to kid ourselves that American society is a classless society, but we all know that that's false.
That's very true.
even going back, one of my favorite books about the Ozarks is written by Charles Morrow Wilson, who was a great journalist, but he grew up in southern Missouri, loved southern Missouri, and it includes early in his book about being derided by H.L. Mencken, who has, in all fairness, just unbelievably racist things to say about hillbillies.
Yeah.
and I think that there's something incredibly important in going to the quote unquote peasant class of any society and engaging in that, and not from I'm better than you, I'm going to study you like a lab rat, but simply being a part of it. It's very powerful.
I think so too. And aside from the fact it's the existence that 99.9% of people have.
Yes. And I was, something to throw out to our viewers and followers is I'm very curious in terms of personal experiences that you all might have in terms of growing up, similar possibly to Michael Cannon experience, etc. But just things that, for example, that only your people do, in all reality are likely passed down multiple generations, sometimes much further back than you would imagine. These things are important and they're to be valued.
Well, and to be honest, that was part of the motivation for us doing this in the first place is
Yes,
is making a record of some of these things.
Which is there's a lot to work with. Continuing to jump in to the fairy tales, and then we'll start sort of doing point counterpoint over into Ozark lore. I found this interesting. It was a list on fairytales.com for Germany. but there's a number of key elements of storytelling for German folktales that have become so ingrained. I think it's easy to lose the fact that we don't even think of them as having an origin point. We just think of them as, this is how you tell stories. The peasants who have become heroes, royalty fallen under enchantment, having a female protagonist, often marrying royalty and elevating one's social stature for being good, romanticism of natural places, particularly forests, seeing that the villain gets his or her retribution, often teaching a social moral, the tale of the wandering hero, that the hero, during the hero's journey, there's often a helper, for example, the fairy godmother, or someone to test the character's social morality. The hero must overcome a difficulty. And lastly, objects often have magical properties.
And I think when people think fairy tales are removed, or they're antiquarian, we continue to reinvent them in popular culture. And if you go through that list, two of the prime examples in popular culture over the last 100 years are Lord of the Rings and Star Wars.
Yes, very, very much so. Both of which I adore.
Me too. So, but just to let people know, this isn't just a list of, about fairy tales that you were read as a child.
No.
And I do think it's very interesting too, the fact that in Germanic lore, it was common for a woman to be the protagonist, which is not characteristic in a lot of other places.
That's true.
And it also goes to the traditions of witchcraft, etc. And it makes sense because a lot of that in the Middle Ages really goes back to the Germanic areas that were strong brewmasters. And a lot of the concept of witchcraft that we are aware of today actually comes from brewing beer and realizing that women, because the ale maids were the ones who basically ran brewing, and then businessmen going, wait a minute, they're making money. We don't like that.
Very, very fair.
And so I think that's interesting. And then the counterpoint quickly with the Ozarks is that we have a strong tradition of granny witches, etc., that again are women, marginalized women being a protagonist typically.
Yes. And an interesting standout, we're so accustomed to these tales that it's easy to overlook, but realistically we'll take even the retelling, the somewhat homogenized, highly popularized retelling in terms of animated films of Snow White and Sleeping Beauty. And we can throw Cinderella in as well. In all three cases, the reality of it is that the prince is really just a side character.
Yes, that's true.
And some, I think, have effectively argued that from an archetypal standpoint, the prince represents not so much the end all nuclear 1950s household dream, but the idea that the prince represents a completion of the female's self, a journey, that it is a representative journey of the female self coming into adulthood rather than a specification of gender roles.
Right.
And I find that telling really interesting, of the idea that these are actually, even dating back to the very original stories, that these are deeply significant and extremely nuanced and sophisticated archetypal stories, helping, in some cases, boys, in the case of the Iron John story, and in many cases girls, to navigate the difficult internal journey of maturation into adulthood.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's telling, because that started hundreds of years ago, that we don't give credit for.
No. And and again, I like you actually stop and think about that. the the protagonist and the antagonist, the real primary characters of Snow White, of Sleeping Beauty, and of Cinderella, are all female.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And ultimately, also, they, to be perfectly honest, ultimately through their own actions, they save themselves, so to speak.
Yes. and if you take it even further with the idea that this is a complex archetypal tale of traversing the path from childhood into adulthood, and that this is an internal journey that we're seeing with external archetypal pieces. The prince represents simply another part of the girl's journey within herself.
Exactly.
And so it is from that perspective of these fairy tales, which on a cursory or summary reading can be derided as old-fashioned, passe. You need to retell the story so that it's different, so on and so forth. I think on a subconscious level, one of the reasons these stories resonate so strongly is because they are telling an archetypal truth. But I think it, from this perspective, this sort of internal point of adolescence, that, and I guess for people who might be going, what on earth is it that I'm talking about? The idea that, for example, we'll take Snow White as an example, that the Snow White character would represent the conscious aspect of a girl embarking into adolescence.
Right.
And the various other characters represent either aspects of her own personality or elements within her own psyche that must be navigated: the dark side, the light side, the decision-making side. And so the prince really just could represent, and I think does, a point where the girl says, I'm going to wake up and be my own person.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot to that. I think that for all of their charm, it's hard for us to view these tales in a pre-Disney sense, because we've been so inundated with the Disney version, which does turn it, at least on the surface, more into the damsel being rescued.
Yes, I tend to agree, and I I think that's interesting. We have a divergence of perception. I grew up loving every single Disney animated film that was ever made. So and I still watch them, just in case anybody wonders. But you're right. You're 100% right, and in the sense that these versions have, for now we're looking at 80 years worldwide, these versions have become the definitive version of these stories.
Yes. And again, our divergence, I certainly watched them and grew up with them, but perhaps, maybe it was unconscious that, part of what grated with me with these was the fact that, wait a minute, she basically is saving herself and making her own decisions.
Yes. And I think it's a really powerful read. And I think it is also, and jumping back, something that we don't have divergence on. We both love the original Star Wars trilogy,
Oh
and
yeah.
something that I think resonated again worldwide. I think in both cases, I think with George Lucas's Star Wars, and with Disney's, particularly Snow White, which really kicked things off.
Yeah.
That there was something archetypally needed that was being said. It was it was being shared, and perhaps it could be argued in both cases imperfectly, and yet good enough to resonate with millions and millions of people.
Exactly. And not necessarily exactly the same with everyone. I mean, and I think that's one thing to say, that's okay too. So
Yes, and should be, and something that, that in essence, the wandering hero, who is also a peasant,
yes,
is, or the royalty who has lost their royal status.
that people don't know. Yes. Mhm.
And I think that I think that has an enormous amount of resonance, not only on children but on adults,
Mhm.
um, because we identify with it.
We do, and and to be honest, it's very American. It's, that you can remake yourself, that you can start at one station in life and end at another, you know, uh, at least in the fairy tales. And that's something that that is very American as well as just archetypical.
Yes, and deeply Old West.
Yes. Like,
and and I think it is fair to say that in many cases, certainly not all, but I think in many cases, um, that potential was something that drew many immigrants from Europe to North America.
certainly. And so it's no wonder that these kind of stories continue to resonate and kind of, in a way, morph into larger um, kind of stories. Superhero uh, media is a good example now, and it's
Yes.
very American, very archetypal. You
Hmm.
have all of these very much same themes generally,
Yes.
and it's just being remade one way or another. Um, One point I wanted to throw out too is when we're talking about these traditional tales, um, and we're talking about Germanic tales, people want often differentiate in regions in Europe. Um, Nordic tales are very popular right now,
Hmm.
influenced by pop culture.
Yes.
Um, a lot of the tales that came over the Atlantic with early settlers were, of course, based in the British Isles,
Hmm.
Celtic and Anglo-Saxon. Um, but there's actually a lot of research and folklorists who believe that basically both of those traditions ultimately go back to Germanic influences anyway. And
Yes.
so uh, in some respects, you can say all Northern European tales are Germanic in some source.
In some source and in some way. And I think that if not directly, then certainly influenced by,
Yeah.
Something that, well, when you look at the people group formation of England shortly after the fall of the Roman Empire, or the deterioration of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
We're looking at the 6th and 7th century, 5th and 6th century. That the original barbarian invaders of England were the Anglo-Saxons, who were Germanic tribes in
Yes.
present approximately modern day Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, that came over and pushed the Romanized Celts west into modern day Wales.
Yes.
And so, first of all, you have, these were Germanic people groups, and the Anglos of the Anglo-Saxon invaders ultimately gave the name Angles land or England to England.
Right.
So you see that level of substrate influence in terms of the Anglo-Saxon tales. And I think it's really interesting that spectral dogs and the wild hunt are such predominant features of Anglo-Saxon England, because it's the the hunt, the ghostly hunt in the sky, directly ties to Odin.
Yes. And in some of the oldest versions, are not even related to Odin, are strictly Germanic, on the continent. And so it goes back to what you were saying about recipes earlier. These things are handed down through generations, and we don't think about them or where they come from. And particularly with the migrations of people like that, they get commingled. And
Very much
so,
so, yeah.
and so you have all of those influences. And one particular that might be a good example is Rawhead and Bones, because
Yes.
it's very much an English story, but in some tellings, it's very Germanic.
Yes. And in some tellings, it's very African American.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Oh, and there's various versions.
Yes.
Where would you like to start?
Well, I guess maybe let's start a little bit with the fact that Rawhead and Bones typically started as an English tale, and in various forms involved a reanimation, whether animal, it's usually animal of some sort, and usually there was a cautionary tale involved.
Right.
And when we get to the Ozarks, it's funny because in some sources it comes out saying it's a Missouri tale, and Hodgson Holler is not mentioned. That's definitely the Arkansas version. And I kind of like a commingling, because I like the detail, pinning it to a particular place in the Ozarks. But I also like some of the other versions that basically mirror Little Red Riding Hood.
Yes.
Which is very Germanic.
It is extremely Germanic. And so Uh,
But generally, whichever version we have usually a witch, or at least a
mhm,
outsider elderly woman, um, a healer or a witch,
mhm.
um, just on subsistence level, with a pet pig.
Yes. And you could I could be really highfalutin and draw, you know, ties between the pet pig and uh the symbolism of the boar in both Nordic and Celtic traditions,
Mhm.
so on and so forth. I think in this particular case that might be a little too academic in terms of the simple reality that since 1548 we got razorbacks in these hills.
That's right. And so, and they tend to be scary. So
Yeah, and dangerous.
yes, so from the outset, you have a sense of danger or risk. Um, the the pig is usually described as more scary looking than a normal pig. Um,
Yes,
uh, and at some point, someone kills the pig.
right. And there's
Eh,
there's some, well, I think I'm game. I could, because I've collected one version of the story from Lance Estep,
mhm.
and can just, it's comparatively short. I can just share that story if you like, and then we can do point counterpoint comparison on it.
We can do that, and I've got the story that is basically the Little Red Riding Hood version uh,
Yes,
from S.E. Schlosser. So
yes, and I have that printed out as well. It's which there are a lot of similarities there
yeah,
between, and so some differences and some similarities. So this I think is here's the short version.
okay.
An old witch named Betty lived at Hogscald Holler, which is a real place, in case anybody wonders, um, in the Boston Mountains near in Arkansas. She had a pet razorback, which, like all hogs, would root around all the time. Oftentimes, this razorback would get into Betty's potions and spells, and once the hog magically gained the ability to walk upright and talk like a man. However, the potions came with a terrible side effect. The flesh of the hog's face was eaten away. Just the same, the witch loved the razorback, and she named him Rawhead. One day, a local farmer shot Rawhead and scalded him in Hogscald Holler. The witch used her magic ball to find her beloved animal and brought the pieces back to life. Bloody bones, get up and dance, she chanted. Lightning struck the hog's body and his bones came back together. She used magic to give Rawhead the claws of a dead bear, the teeth of a dying panther, and the tail of a rotting raccoon, whereupon Rawhead sought vengeance on the farmer. Finding him on the road, Rawhead chased the farmer back to his farm, cornering him in the barn. Frightened, but believing it to be some kind of prank, the farmer asked, "What are those big eyes for?" And Rawhead replied, "To see your grave." Believing it was someone wearing a terrible mask, the farmer asked, "What are those big teeth for?" And Rawhead said, "To eat you up like you wanted to eat me." And trying to stay calm, the farmer said, "What are those big claws for?" Rawhide snorted, "To dig your grave." "Land of Goshen," exclaimed the farmer. "What is that bushy tail for?" Rawhide hesitated for just a moment and then screamed, "To sweep your grave," pouncing on the farmer. Still, the man was able to get away, jump on his horse, and ride pell-mell into the dark forest, proving he was slightly luckier than Quantrell. Um,
Oh, slightly.
however, but not for long. Rawhide knew the woods better than the old farmer, and he raced ahead, cutting him off at a narrow bluff. Leaping upon the farmer, Rawhide sliced the farmer's head clean off, and then rode through town upon the horse, holding the farmer's head high above for everyone to see. The end.
The end. Which again, we have a strong tradition of severed heads in the Ozarks.
Yes, we do.
From Native American tribes, Osage and others, as well as from the Celtic traditions.
Yes.
And saw that a lot in the Civil War. So that kind of imagery is not surprising
No.
for Ozark's tale whatsoever. And the Schlosser version, and it's funny because it specifically says it's a Missouri tale, does not place it in Arkansas or in the holler, that particular holler. But again, you have Betty and you have Rawhead, and but it goes into more detail, mimicking the language of Little Red Riding Hood, which I find very interesting. Basically, in this version, it's a hunter that hunts him down, so farmer, but you go into all of the Wolf and Riding Hood dialogue. What are those big eyes for? And see your grave, Rawhead says. Very funny. He responds. And what have you got those big claws for? You look ridiculous to dig your grave. But it goes on and on and on. And at no point does the hunter recognize. It even says he thinks it's a kid. He thinks it's a child. Yeah. Which is it's at the opposite of Little Red Riding Hood, where ostensibly Red never recognizes the wolf not being grandma.
Yes.
It's the same thing but reversed.
Yes. Which is interesting, to say the least. And
it is.
it in terms of parsing out the art.
And in this version there is no severed head, and the hunter's never so there's no sign of him ever again, or his horse.
Horse
he rode in on.
Oh, lots of moving parts. It's of course it makes me very curious too. It makes me wonder in regards to the point of origin for this particular story. And whether we're dealing with a story that really does have strong archetypal foundations, or a story that appears to have strong archetypal foundations because it was pulled from multiple comparatively modern sources and then stirred heavily.
Well, the only thing that makes me say that's not the case is that there are the Rawhead and Blaybones stories in England that go back hundreds of years. So
right.
So I don't think that part. I don't think it's necessarily just pulled from modern sources, and although the strong similarity to Little Red Riding Hood seems to be more tied to the Ozarks version than the English versions, and I would say that's more of a, Germanic lore influence, for whatever reason.
Right. And it there is a Rawhead and Bloody Bones foundational stories associated with Low Country South Carolina culture, but
Yeah,
it's a very different story.
it's a different story, and and in that situation, that they tend to think that it was passed from the planter class to the slaves,
Mm-hmm.
instead of being more of a peasant story
Mm-hmm.
originally,
Right.
which would um, make you think that it's more a version brought from England and then changed a bit over time.
Mm-hmm. Or, and I'm purely conjecturing at this point, the title, the name of the being in question,
Mm-hmm.
being brought from England by the planters, but that the essentially the the West African slaves who were just learning English,
Mm-hmm.
using the title to describe part of their own lore.
I think that's fair too. I think that there's aspects of that make a lot of sense. So
It's, again, there's an enormous number of moving parts. It's a fun story. There's and again, as we talked about, you cannot help but draw some comparisons with Little Red Riding Hood, which
yeah,
has its own series of archetypal qualities, and of course draws a direct line, an unmistakable line to 18th century German peasantry.
it does, and in the end, the old lady and Rawhead prevail, kind of the
Yes,
way that Red and Grandma do.
yes, exactly. Which and I do like the inversion of expectation with this story, which is comparatively old. It Rawhead and Bloody Bones at Hogscald Holler is not a new story.
No.
But I do find it interesting that the villain is a farmer and the hero is a witch and a zombie hog.
There you go. You can't get better horror than that. So
No. It is. Now a couple of, well, a handful of approximately 6 stories that have German origins that are lesser known. One of them, a couple of them really jumped out at me. Not the first one, although I do find it really interesting. Lorelei, the original Lorelei myth, is essentially a siren, but on a river, which I find really fascinating. The German stories of changelings are certainly distinguishable, but still extremely similar to changelings across Europe,
right.
in terms of that lore. This one, which I want to do some more research on, the Werewolf of Morbach. The last place a werewolf was killed was around 1988. Thought that was a little recent.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that stretches incredibility to me a little bit. But
the Princess Brunhilde at Rostrap in the Harz Mountains. The evidence left behind being hoof prints in the rock from one side of a chasm to another. Princess was fleeing a forced marriage to Bodo the giant. She and her white stallion leaped across the gorge, and the giant followed but didn't make it. But the stallion left the hoof prints. This reminds me of a story that I grew up with from my grandfather, who worked in South Dakota um, in the late 20s as a cowboy.
Mhm.
And it was on the Missouri River, which has since been dammed at that location near Mitchell.
Oh.
But there was a location on the river. It was a series of bluffs. It's called Medicine Rock, I do believe.
Mhm.
And the region's Lakota people considered Medicine Rock to be sacred, and they would host um, big rodeos out there. So Grandpa would, as a young man, would go out on a pretty regular basis, and they'd roast pit roast bison,
Mhm.
and Grandpa did not like his meat rare, and so the issue was to time your place in line properly, because the outside of the bison was burnt to a crisp and the inside of the bison was completely raw, so you needed to time yourself where you were in line with your plate to get a piece of
You
meat
get
that was
the way you wanted. Okay, I
yeah.
like it's
And
practical.
but the rodeo took place in what he described as sort of a natural amphitheater
Mhm.
in the rock, and up above there was one rock on one side that had a very large footprint embedded in the stone itself,
Oh, wow.
and on the other side of the amphitheater was a corresponding footprint that something had walked across,
Oh, wow.
but that something had feet that appeared to be human,
Mm.
and and but embedded the footprints in the stone. I never forgot that story. With the impoundment of the Missouri River at that location, that entire amphitheater and stone is underwater.
Oh,
No big surprise. Um,
too many
but it
things that's happened to, although lots of good things have happened from from damming up rivers too. So
yeah, but it never forgot the story. That the Princess Brunhilde at Rostrep, with the hoof prints on two sides of the chasm that don't make any sense. I that really resonated with me. But also the story of and I can't think of the name of it right now, which is terrible. The hill in Scotland with the the stone that the king needs to go stand his feet in the footprints of
what's in
of the
Ireland? That's in
is
Ireland.
okay.
Yeah. I can see the stone. I can't think of the name of it right now, but yes.
Same.
And many people think that it's the source of the story of Point Excalibur from the stone,
Right.
um, because there was a carving in the stone in the shape of a boot print, and when the new king was crowned, he would put his foot in that uh, imprint. And so,
Yes.
some people think that got twisted into point a sword out of the stone.
Yes. And I think that's potentially fair.
Right.
The last two stories that jumped out at me, the lore surrounding the Watsman Mountains, in the deep southern corner of Bavaria, a tyrannical king named Watsman, who hunted local peasants. And I find this to
Always
be
fun.
it is such an interesting theme, that, and certainly um, the tyranny and or the horror of being hunted,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is a resonating theme for a variety of German folk tales,
Mhm.
particularly involving the dark of the forest, or in the mountains. And it
Yeah.
is, to me, it is Well, if you begin to strip away the archetypal elements and the simply the fantastical elements, and consider the possibility that these stories do have, a basis in someone's experience, it can be pretty horrifying pretty quickly.
Very much so, very much so. And I think there is some, I think it, I think those kind of tales do resonate here, and and not so much for folklore per se, but real events in the Ozarks, particularly during the Civil War. I mean,
Hmm.
there's a lot of analogy.
And although this is Ozarks borderlands, um into Kansas, but the Benders come to mind.
Oh yes, the Bloody Vendors, yes. Cherry Vale. I mean, it's definitely the borderlands. Actually, not too far from an area that's called the Little Ozarks, um, in southern Kansas. Um, but uh, it's very much based on, well, one, it's a true story of innkeepers who preyed on their guests to rob them, and then would bury them in the garden, in the yard, and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
And this went on for quite a while, and was not discovered because it typically was, people passing through and no one knowing what happened to them. And in times when we weren't in instant communication all the time, so people were on the road and they just didn't show up in California or whatever. Um, but what happened was, one particular traveler came through and was had connections. His family were well-to-do politicians, I think in Iowa, if I remember right, Iowa or Nebraska. And they knew he was going through, and he didn't show up wherever he was going. And so his brother ends up coming down and basically rattling chains, trying to figure out where he'd been. And they figured out that he had stayed there. And enough happened that he got basically a posse to go out, and they started finding bodies.
Yeah.
So, but in the course of things, the Benders got wind of it and they left,
Hmm.
and they were never found.
Mm. And even though, it's not the same, I can't help but draw some points of comparison between that and the Staffelbacks.
Well, definitely. And in fact, well, the Staffelbats in Galena, Kansas, which was about 20, 24, 25 years later, in the 1890s, they were compared to the Benders.
Hmm.
And uh, although it realistically probably did not have as many victims, but they did kill for profit. Although ironically, they did get caught, and ironically, the murder that they got caught for was not for profit. It was a crime of passion, and got the better of them. Um, and it's still very controversial to this day.
Hmm.
Um, but sort of a twist on the hero's journey, ironically, one of the few surviving, not few, but one of the surviving direct descendants of the Staffelbats ended up being war hero in World War One, and was
Yes.
literally the most decorated soldier in World War One. So,
Yes. Which is, it bears.
or at least from Missouri, he was the most decorated
Mhm.
soldier from Missouri, I should say. I don't know.
And it really bears, looking at that from a point counterpoint perspective, and the fact that at the end of the day, each of us, regardless of our lineage or our ethnic group or anything else, have the capacity to make certain decisions for ourselves.
Exactly. Exactly. Although that story gets a little more involved, and that's for another day.
It is. I'm gonna I'm gonna burrow into the Staffelbeck for just a moment as we're talking
Okay.
about like this dark German lore. A common element of our German fairy tales is the archetypal witch.
Mm-hmm.
Um, sometimes for good, sometimes for evil, and and well, I won't go into that. But anyway, not because it was weird, just because I went, oh wait, that I was going to say that there was counterpoint with the Cinderella's fairy godmother, but the godmother was a Disney invention. She wasn't the original story. But
Yeah.
uh, which, as an aside, that in the original German version of, which was admittedly a somewhat French origin story with Cinderella, no fairy godmother, but white doves sent from Cinderella's dead mother to
Yes.
warn her about things. And at the end of the story, they peck out the eyes of the stepsisters.
Yes.
Like full on The Crow.
Yeah, which is strong indications of Odin. So
Fortunately, I think it's probably good they didn't animate that in 1951.
probably that's probably fair.
Small children run screaming out of the theater. Yeah, I'm sorry, you didn't know you were coming to a showing of Night of the Living Dead, but they're
And the stepsisters also cut parts of their feet off to fit in the shoe too. So
yes, they did. Yes, they did, which gave them away because there was blood gushing out of their slipper.
the miraculously paint for blood loss.
Yes, yes. I think so the story, one of the stories surrounding the Staffelbeck murders in Galena, Mrs. Staffelbeck, the matriarch, whose I believe husband was a candy maker.
Yes. Michael Staffelbeck, the father, was a candy maker from Switzerland originally, and immigrated.
And she was a midwife.
And she was a midwife. She was born in Utica, New York, and was part Indian. And they had ended up meeting either in Iowa or Illinois somewhere, and getting married, and then settling in St. Louis, and basically traveling down future Route 66 over time.
Yes. and so you have a granny woman motif as a midwife.
Yes.
You have candy.
Mm-hmm.
And again, and you can tell me whether or not this is grounded in fact, but certainly it's a tale that is surrounding it. That one of the probably the notable murder that was observed was that their victim in relationship to this crime of passion had essentially been shot in the street.
Mm-hmm.
And Mrs. Staffelbeck walks out of her house, which is also a brothel,
Mm-hmm.
walks down to the man who's been shot,
Mm-hmm.
pulls out her butcher knife, slits his throat.
It was a corn knife. Mm-hmm.
And wipes the blade on her apron.
Mm-hmm.
And goes back to the house to finish making chili.
Yes, that was the testimony of two witnesses. One of them was a daughter-in-law of hers, and both of the girls were inmates in the brothel or prostitutes.
That's Hansel and Gretel right there. Um,
Pretty much, except for Frank Gifford wasn't a child, but yeah. Yeah, she was just putting it into it, and then they threw his body in the mine shaft until nighttime or no, actually, they put it under the bed, and then at night threw it in the mine shaft.
I love the good old days. They were simpler, kinder, gentler.
Well, there were a lot in Galena. There were just a lot of holes that you could fall into. So
Exactly. Even as a corpse.
that's right. There were tales from the police and the prosecuting attorney that there could be up to 50 victims and that was based on the number of corpses that they found in mine shafts. But the problem is you had 30,000 transient miners in town, and getting drunk and falling down a mine shaft and being the victim of even an axe murder have very similar injuries. So that's the problem is
Which, made for a yeah, wide variety of potentiality. That, there I really had like done a point counterpoint of the elements from the dark German fairy tales to that particular Stapleback murder, but wow.
Oh, it gets more that there's more to there's more counterpoints to that, but that's an extended discussion itself.
That's fair. Oh, but it's the location is really neat. Um,
It is.
in Galena, Kansas, which is in the Ozarks, just barely, is it's a really neat town. I would.
It is. It's unique in its history, and you still have a little bit of the feisty nature to it.
And now this is jumping subjects, but a couple of somewhat lesser known characters in our folk tales to consider: the Shelley Coats being one of them, and the kobolds being another. What are your thoughts on these?
Shelley coats, they river, usually the coat's made of shells. It just reminds me of a bridge troll in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
As far as fair in the story. Liminal places, a crossing, a border. I think they kind of speak to our fears of what's in the dark and what can you reach out and grab us.
Very, very much so. And I think our fear of threshold, the point that this is but from a conceptual, an archetypal, or a literal threshold, the point of change is very frightening. And for anybody that's like laughing about, oh, what would you be concerned about crossing a river? I would counter that with the level of fear and anxiety someone feels simply about making a major change in their life.
A major change in their life, just risk. Traditionally, a lot of people couldn't swim. So it was a risk. Often crossings were kind of a gated thing because you had to pay a ferry or someone, because just crossing rivers wasn't always an easy option. And as I said that, the scene from Josie Wales and the Missouri boat ride came to mind.
Yes.
Um, and that there are gatekeepers that you may not know or are aware of, from the other side of the veil. That's that whole lore that
Yes,
that makes people uncomfortable.
it does. And I think a certain amount of, in some cases, personified anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
um, but also an acceptance of respect to those points of crossing, both literal and figurative.
Yes. Well, and I think an example that people can from lore that people are familiar with are um, Billy Goat's Gruff, uh, having to answer a riddle to cross something
Mhm.
or to gain entrance to something. Um,
Yes,
that there's risk involved.
right. Very, very much so. And then something that really um, jumped out to me in regards to the kobolds, this kind of three versions, an underground version like the Tommyknockers,
Yeah,
a maritime or a sailing ship version of which I was unfamiliar, and
I
then
had I wasn't either until then either.
and then the homestead, the kobolds of the homestead, that in some ways really reminded me of the concept of the buttery sprite,
Yeah.
and which also reminds me very much of Stonehill Winery in Herman. Um, I'm I know the sign says that it's supposed to be a ghost, and I'm not saying it isn't, but I just have a really strong inclination that it's a sprite, um, or possibly a kobold. But something else that is there's a couple of things about kobolds that really jumped out to me. One, their relationship or similarity to the Norse Tomte, um, and the idea that these were that in sort of their original understanding that they exist outside of what we think of as traditional categories of these, and that's very appealing to me. But that they are um, ancestor spirits
Mm-hmm.
that over the many generations are there to guard the farm and the ancestral farm, and that they're then associated with the burial mounds, which these would have been ancient pagan burial mounds on the farm,
Right.
of and the idea that if the farm has remained within the same family, this is your great add a few more greats, grandparents or grandfather of the farm, and that they are both physical and non-physical.
Mm-hmm.
They're both spirit and person,
Mm-hmm.
and that they, when they manifest themselves, they oftentimes appear as basically little old men, but about the size of a 4-year-old child.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you respect the farm, if you respect the land, if you respect the livestock, then they'll probably go out of their way to protect you. They'll protect the everything that you're doing. They'll protect the livestock from disease. They'll protect you from storm. They might protect you from intruders. They might even go the extra step and like clean your kitchen for you while you're asleep.
Well, that'd be
Um,
nice.
it would be very nice. But if you disrespect them, they may kill you.
Yes, and these are very similar themes to uh, some Native American stories in the Ozarks.
Mhm.
The sense of spirit and flesh at the same time. uh, you see that with a lot of the tribes, and then the association with burial mounds, and
Yes.
it's very much the same stories that tribes told of moving into the Ozarks and being around the mounds that were there previously, and that they really believed there were spirits there.
Yes. Yes. And something that also seems similar as a, between the two,
Mhm.
is the idea that if you understand the lore, if you
Mhm.
and you respect it, that you can essentially inherit their respect.
Right. And gain respect and acceptance, even uh, and so it comes down to how you conduct yourself and how you treat the land and so forth, uh,
Yes,
and not doing so respectfully is at your own peril.
very much so. And that the reaction, if you start doing stupid things, that the the, the reaction um can begin with just sort of disturbing but irritating situations,
Yes.
but then that it can escalate very quickly to things that are dramatically more troublesome,
Mhm.
or even malevolent and dangerous. And I think something that is often, through a modern prism, or perspective, the nuances of this sort of story are lost, because once something gets categorized as malevolent, then it's just called, like, well, that's the devil.
Right. It's devil, demon, evil, and it becomes a very flat, one-sided face.
And it become and the at that point, the perspective shifts to simply good versus evil, but the human victim is the good, and the malevolent force is the evil. In this case, yeah, and at that point, there's really nothing to be learned.
Right.
um
It's
in
true.
in in this case, it's saying, wow, you're disrespecting the land. um you know
But but again, that's a sense of punishment, and that is a theme in a lot of Germanic lore, is that
yes,
if you misuse things or aren't respectful of the land or the forest, or um, those that are dependent on you, or are powerless, then you're going to be punished.
yes, yes. And that's I think that's a very uncomfortable place, because we don't want to be responsible for those types of larger actions.
Very, very true. Very true. I want to throw in another tale,
Yes,
and that's of the Fader Wish, and
yes,
as it relates to one of your favorite stories from the
yes.
Ozarks too. Um,
Yes, do tell.
I find it a very interesting story, German tale, folk tale of a farmer, again,
Hmm.
rural area farmer, and he has three daughters, and there is this little man, again, it's the midget or the little person with perhaps powers, living in the forest, and he comes to the farmer and says that he needs a wife, and the farmer gives him his oldest daughter because uh, Baderwish is very wealthy and he's hoping to curry favor. And the next spring he comes back and says the wife is dead, and so he gives him his second daughter. The next year comes back and she's dead too, and so gives him the youngest daughter. And at first she's very happy. She likes living there. And then one day her husband is gone doing something, and there's one room that is forbidden. She's not supposed to go in there, and she can't resist. She opens the door and finds her sisters hanging from the rafters dead. And so she panics and knows he's going to be back. And so basically she covers herself with animal fat and feathers and leaves, and meets him on the road, and he doesn't recognize her, and is able to get back to her father and tell him what happens. And then of course they end up killing him. And so he's punished for what he did. But she, again, she fools him, and he doesn't recognize who she is. And that's a very powerful, I think that's a very powerful theme, is that there is power even to the powerless in those situations.
Interesting, yes. And you think, in terms of how those elements of the narrative could speak to individuals who did feel powerless.
Mm-hmm. That there is a way to win,
Yes.
And of course, in modern storytelling, we'd say it's the everyman. He finds a way, to rise above.
Mm-hmm.
But she was able to do it when, obviously her sisters hadn't figured out a way. So,
right.
But it reminds me of a ghost story that you're fond of telling.
Oh, the story of Mary Calhoun,
Yes.
which had a number of actually, Irish elements to it. I do find it fun. The situation with so many Irish stories is that there is a wink in everything. There's a mischievousness to it. German tales do not often have the teasing sense of mischievousness. It's pretty heavy-handed.
Yes. Which of course this one was,
Yes.
too. But
hey, your sisters are dead.
Yes. And I told you that we're coming back and killing you. So
yes. But I think that it again, I think that there's a lot of elements to that narrative that speak to the people, and in some cases very dominantly speak to the time in which these stories were told. Or very often, we see Germany through the 20th century lens, which had its own monumental tragedies.
yes.
But in the 1700s, the 1600s, the 1500s, there were, wave after wave of incredibly dark times for the people who were essentially German. Germany, like Italy, are comparatively new states, although the people groups who were speaking the common languages or common shared dialects have been in those regions for thousands of years.
Well, one of the most famous German tales, Hansel and Gretel, is about the Great Famine.
Mm-hmm.
And when people literally did leave their kids in the forest to die because they couldn't feed them.
Yes.
So
it's really horrific when you think about it. And,
yes.
And
but to Mary Calhoun, to Mary Calhoun, perhaps a quick rendition and to illustrate how she problem solved a little bit, like the girl in the Fader Wish story.
I do like the counterpoint. Did you want me to go ahead and tell? tell it? Okay. uh, it is my favorite. It's my favorite current Ozarks ghost story, and it has a strong Irish background. But the telling itself is from the Ozarks, probably the Missouri Ozarks, and is a story of Mary, who's coming of age girl with three younger brothers. And Mary is notable in that she works very hard to take care of her family. And she comes in just as the sun is setting, and her father, who's quite a bit older, has realized that he has left his cane at the cemetery. And he says, would you be a good girl and run and fetch my cane for me? So she does. But as she runs into the cemetery, just as the sun passes behind the ridges, and she walks up to the grave to pick up the cane, and something described as heavy as death and as light as a corn husk crawls up out of the grave. And as soon as it touches her, she becomes enchanted and cannot respond. And she feels it as it crawls up her leg, up her body, up onto and sits on her shoulder, and whispers with a voice like the winter wind in the leaves, and whispers in her ear and commands her to walk back home. And she does, in a trance, and she's unable to disobey the voice in her ear. And she goes back, and it's suddenly night, and it commands her to go into the kitchen, which then she does, and it commands her to pull a knife from the cupboard, which she cannot resist, and it commands her to go upstairs and slit the throats of her three brothers as they lie sleeping, which, trembling and with tears pouring out of her eyes, she slits their throats, and she drains their blood into a bowl as she's commanded, takes it back down to the kitchen, and the thing on her shoulder commands her to stir the blood into a gruel, and then it commands her to eat it. And while she is crying and stirring, it starts talking, and it starts talking about the treasure that it has buried, and it's talking about how once she has eaten the gruel, that it not just will have enchanted her for the night, but it will own her soul for all eternity. But Mary is very clever, and as she sits down at the table, she's wearing a kerchief around her neck, and as she can't not obey to lift the spoon to her mouth, but she manages the loophole that she drops the gruel into her kerchief instead of tasting it. After the porridge, the gruel, has been eaten, it commands her to return to the cemetery, where presumably, because it believes she has eaten the gruel, that it will take her down into the nether regions with it. She gets to the cemetery just as dawn is almost to break, and it says that it's going to claim her soul. And she yells out to it, "But I've eaten none of your bloody gruel," just as the sun peeks over the ridge. And in a shriek, the thing shatters into something like hoarfrost and ice and disappears. She jerks the kerchief off and runs home to find her three brothers waking up, having said that they had the most horrific of nightmares. And she is filled with gratitude that her family is safe. Her father, at her direction, later comes into a large quantity of gold, but Mary never, ever again sets foot in the cemetery.
Fair. Now, one thing is that the idea of the enchantment, that's very common in German lore too.
Yes.
So many tales are some sort of enchantment, whether
yes,
white, you know, so many of them are. And then, but the young person getting the hoodwink over the supposedly wiser character.
Yes, the to have the wits to outsmart an eternal evil
Yes.
is very gratifying.
And in the end, they were rewarded with gold.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. And
And
it's a great sense of ambiguity in the darkness.
yes, but I do like the similarities and the parallels with the Federwish stories. So
I do too. I want to look up more of that one. I was not familiar with that particular story. It's very
I wasn't until we were researching this week.
it's very it's very evocative, and as a good German fairy tale should be, it's really dark.
It's dark and bloody and
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think that might be a good place to wrap up for the evening.
I think so. So everyone, have a good week. We'll be back next week, and we might actually be in the same room, I think.
We just might. We'll see.
And we'll see. Well, bearing weather. And if you guys have anything that you would like us to talk about or answer questions, let us know, and we'll do our best to do that.
Absolutely. We appreciate everybody. Appreciate you, Lisa.
Appreciate you, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone have a good night.
Night, y'all.